Hello everyone. Tonight we start with the ultimate unit, Homo neanderthalensis. These strong, intelligent, and misunderstood cousins of ours not only survived the ice era, but they also pushed it. Neanderthals were more than simply cavemen. They were nature's gym rats with an eye for interior design, as evidenced by their incredible strength and unexpected civilization. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. You would most likely freeze solid in 30 seconds if you had wandered into Ice Age Europe some 80,000 years ago. A Neanderthal, the local apex hominid, and perhaps the only animal on the planet that appeared capable of defeating a mammoth in a wrestling bout, may be spotted before that. Not only were Neanderthals distinct from contemporary people, but they were also more suited for punishment. Consider a human who was created by a group of Arctic engineers, bodybuilders, and someone who genuinely enjoyed forehead real estate. A Neanderthal, that is. First, let's discuss the body. Calling Neanderthals short is inaccurate because they were, on average, between 5'4" and 5'6", shorter than us. They weren't little. They possessed broad shoulders, large rib cages, stocky, compact frames, and a build so solid that it appeared as though their bones had been reinforced for demolition work. They were, quite frankly, too qualified for anything short of full-contact, massive takedowns because to their thick and robust bones. Because their limbs were strong and short, they were able to retain heat in extremely cold environments. Their large hands and powerful thumbs made them ideal for making tools, snatching animals, and maybe opening pickle jars, tasks that contemporary humans would never even try. And the face comes next. Neanderthals didn't appear strange. We appear strange. They have long, low skulls with pronounced brow ridges that might have been used for ski jumps. They had big, forward-facing noses, which may have served as an internal warmer for the icy air of the Ice Age. Their chins were essentially non-existent, their jaws were strong, and their faces probably ranged from mildly perplexed to constantly prepared for battle. Do not be misled, however. These were not savage thugs. This wasn't a failed prototype of humanity. This was a parallel success story. They were completely adapted to their surroundings, and they flourished there. When it came to ice storms, cave bears, and using a sharpened stick to hunt food, Neanderthals were the best endurance athletes of their time. Every inch of them said, "Yes, I've broken several ribs. I don't regret it, no." Sit down if you've ever lifted a milk jug without injuring yourself and felt proud of your bone density. Walking fortresses were what Neanderthals were. Not only were their skeletons strong, but they were strong for medieval architecture. We're talking about bones so thick that they resembled cheap chopsticks compared to the femurs of modern humans. First, let's talk about their legs. Short and extraordinarily strong, Neanderthal femurs were made for pushing over rugged, hilly terrain, while toting around half a reindeer on one shoulder, not for running marathons. Their knees were made to withstand a lot of bending and crouching, which is helpful when you spend much of your day elbow-deep in big animal carcasses, crafting stone tools or lighting fires. Their arms, just as terrifying. They were exceptional among hominins in that their forearms were even thicker than their upper arm bones. This was more than a show. They weren't just showing off on Instagram. They were actually designed to carry massive prey across the stony tundra and use hefty tools. Neanderthals were jackhammers with eyebrows if modern people are constructed like Swiss Army knives. They even had rib cages that told a tale. The rib cage of modern humans is more barrel-shaped and taper toward the waist. However, Neanderthals' large lungs were made possible by their broad, flaring rib cages, which were probably essential for surviving the frigid, oxygen-poor air of glacial Europe. Their respiration system essentially functioned similarly to industrial bellows. More mammoth chasing energy out, more oxygen in. And let's not forget the skull. Not just the brow ridges, although those were magnificent. Their skulls were longer, flatter and thicker, with larger areas for muscle attachment. That means strong neck and mouth muscles. They most likely wouldn't blink when chewing frozen venison. Curiously, there was a price for this stronger skeleton. They probably reached adulthood sooner than we did, and their lifespans might have been a little shorter. However, they crammed a lifetime of wounds, fractures, and harsh living into each year while they were alive. Their bones exhibit blunt force injuries, repaired fractures, joint injury, and ongoing wear, as if they were trying out for an action movie set in the prehistoric past. The large, intelligent elephant in the room needs to be addressed. The brains of Neanderthals were enormous, not in a symbolic sense, literally. Compared to our current average of 1350 cubic centimeters, their brains were larger, measuring between 1500 and 1350 cubic centimeters. Yes, the so-called brute cavemen were using powerful cranial engines to move around. Furthermore, they had no spreadsheets to endure. A disclaimer, though, before you call them honorary professors. Being bigger does not always equate to being wiser. Even with its enormous brain, a blue whale hasn't invented indoor plumbing. Neanderthals, however, were not merely transporting cranial burden. They put it to use. Their motor skills, particularly vision and movement coordination, and sensory processing accounted for a significant amount of their brain space. That makes sense when you have to avoid falling off a cliff and stalk elk in a snowstorm as part of your everyday routine. Without the use of Google Maps or opposable thumbs scrolling Instagram, they had to work with equipment, track animals across great distances, and traverse hazardous terrain. They probably had extraordinary vision because of their enlarged visual brain. Imagine eagle-eyed, frost-covered Neanderthals peering dramatically into the snow, akin to characters from Ice Age anime, but with less monologue and more fur. Evidence suggests they weren't acting impulsively, even if their prefrontal cortex, the region that tells us to consider before we act, might have been proportionately smaller than ours. Planning, teamwork, and a surprising amount of inventiveness, including the kind that includes painting cave walls and perhaps applying early cosmetics that resembles ochre, were necessary for their life. Therefore, it's possible that your Neanderthal aunt created contouring long before TikTok existed. In addition, Neanderthals demonstrated remarkable adaptability across Europe and portions of Asia, moving from arid grassland to frozen tundra, which called for a high level of mental flexibility. They learnt to produce tools, construct shelter, use local resources, and sometimes come up with novel ways to injure themselves with flint. Not impressed yet? Give it a try. At one point, we believed that all of their equipment and artwork were taken from early modern people. Then we discovered Neanderthal ornaments and artwork that predate anything created by modern humans in the area. As it happens, we simply arrived late to the underground party. Neanderthals would have won the prize and most likely the trophy as well, only to use it as a hammer if nature had held a design competition for creating things that could survive the worst conditions imaginable. These hominins weren't just adapted to the Ice Age, they were engineered for it. Picture the kind of weather that makes your nose hairs freeze, and now imagine living in that without heated floors, hoodies, or any concept of hot cocoa. That's Neanderthal territory. Their bodies were short and stocky, not by accident but by design. They were able to preserve body heat thanks to their small size, which is precisely what you want when your surroundings resemble the frozen section of a horrible supermarket. Heat is lost more quickly by long, lanky limbs. The limbs of Neanderthals were so short and thick that penguins would have nodded in agreement. They had enormous noses, and no, they weren't used to detect rumors. Prior to the cold air entering their lungs, their enormous nasal cavities assisted in warming and humidifying it. Built right into their faces, it was nature's equivalent of an air conditioning system. An excellent justification for having a face you could put a brick on, as well as a practical adaptation. Their chilly resilience perhaps even came from their skin. The majority of scientists concur that they most likely had lighter skin tones to better manufacture vitamin D in low-light situations, even if we cannot determine their precise pigmentation. Because you'd better be able to extract some sunshine from a gloomy sky if you're going to make it through 6 months of constant misery. Their massive lungs were probably necessary to power bodies engaged in manual labor around the clock, including climbing, hunting, carrying, carving, and occasionally coming up with novel methods to pull muscles. That broad barrel chest was an ancient furnace, not just a showpiece. Clothes? Yes, unless they were interested in that, they weren't roaming around in fur loincloths. Stitching is difficult, and there is evidence that Neanderthals wore sewn hides to protect themselves from the cold. It indicates that they prepared ahead of time, made tools, and most likely had some form of winter clothing, albeit a little less. In summary, Neanderthals were not the underdogs of nature. Rather, they were flourishing during the ice period rather than just surviving it. Their purpose was to march through the cold, groaning softly and wondering why the mammoths were always so dramatic about it. They were nature's snowplows. You most likely picture a single fur slung over one shoulder, possibly supported by a piece of vine, together with a club and a general lack of self-awareness when you think of Neanderthal couture. However, authentic Neanderthal attire was remarkably elegant, primitive to be sure, but functional rather than ostentatious, and with just enough mayhem to make a medieval tailor cry. Let's face it, fashion minimalism was not a fantastic idea in Ice Age Europe. You would freeze to death before you could say saber-toothed mistake if you stepped outside in the winter wearing just positive thoughts and feelings. Thus, Neanderthals became intelligent. There is evidence that they did more than simply cover themselves with animal hides like old couch covers. They used bone needles to treat, soften, and join hides together. Yes, before buttons were even a thing, they were hand-sewing garments out of mammoth and deer. Furthermore, they didn't voice any complaints on Reddit. Let's also discuss accessories. Eagle talons, perforated shells, and beads have been found at certain Neanderthal sites. They apparently enjoyed a little flair because these weren't purely functional. Maybe a dash of symbolism, maybe even some Ice Age swagger. Imagine a Neanderthal saying, "Yes, this claw necklace is real," as they enter the camp. "Yes, I was the one that caught the bird. No, you are not allowed to touch it." They also painted their equipment, bodies, and maybe even faces with ochre, a red pigment that occurs naturally. Was it paint from the war? Ornament? A social signal of some sort? Nobody is certain. However, it does indicate that at one point, a Neanderthal saw a red rock and thought, "This would look amazing on my cheekbones." Did they feel prepared for Fashion Week now? Not unless there was a fierce chase. The runway was snowed over and it was illuminated by fire. However, their attire fulfilled its purpose. They remained dryish, warm, and shielded from the elements and critical humans. Not to be overlooked is the practical genius. All of the clothing was cruelty-free, locally sourced and disposable. Because hunting, that's Ice Age sustainable fashion. Neanderthals were more than just powerful. They were powerfully punching a woolly rhino in the face. Such power raises the question of whether physics was different in those days or whether they were born with an innate membership at the universe's gym. Their anatomy is screaming for power. They had massive muscles, particularly in their arms, legs, and shoulders. Areas required for routine activities such as carrying carcasses, skinning animals, throwing spears, and occasionally lifting rocks for amusement. Those muscles weren't just for show. As we've seen, their bone structure could support a modest siege engine. They were gains in function. But what was their actual strength? According to estimates, a male Neanderthal may be up to 50% stronger than a contemporary person of the same size, and perhaps even twice as strong in the upper body. This isn't dad or farm strong. This will unintentionally tear your cave's door off. They used more than simply skillfully thrown projectiles to hunt from a distance. No, the close touch method was chosen by Neanderthals. They would approach enormous, irate megafauna from the Ice Age and stab them with spears at close range. They prepared meals by avoiding tusks while holding tight to something that wanted them dead. What about the deterioration? Yes, it is visible. There are numerous healed wounds, fractured arms, crushed ribs, and injured heads in their fossil records, all indications that they were resilient as well as robust. Neanderthals either covered broken objects in moss and hoped for the best, or walked them off. They immediately returned to hunting after that. They had tremendous grip strength too. According to some researchers, they could crush the hands of current humans without even trying. They had wider fingers, bigger thumbs, and knuckles that could inflict damage typically found in medieval weapons. You're not far off if you can picture the rock, but it's fuzzier and more likely to hurl a stone axe at you. One thing that Neanderthal fossils always remind us of is how hard life was for these people. Don't forget to wear sunscreen. Not so much as tackled a furious bison before lunch. Their skeletons resemble accident reports from an Ice Age rodeo more than they do somber, ancient diaries. Really, paleoanthropologists observed something strangely familiar when they examined the trauma patterns in Neanderthal remains. The injuries, which included crushed faces, shattered ribs, and broken arms, were remarkably identical to those sustained by professional rodeo riders. It's not a joke either. It seems that your bones tell a very particular kind of story if you spend a lot of time tangled with one-ton beasts for a living. For instance, consider Shanidar 1. In addition to having a withered right arm, most likely from a healed break, this poor man suffered a blow to the head that crushed a portion of his skull and most likely left him half blind. He also had injuries to his foot. He was essentially the human counterpart of a walking before picture from an orthopedic advertisement. Despite these injuries, he lived for years. This indicates that he was being cared for by other Neanderthals, because it seems that your Ice Age friends still make room for you by the fire, even if you're a tank of a man with a limp and one working eye. La Chapelle-aux-Saints, another well-known instance, was an elderly man with terrible arthritis, missing teeth, and spinal problems. And once more, he was obviously taken care of. Thus, Neanderthals were not only sustaining wounds that would frighten contemporary OSHA inspectors, but they were also assisting one another in recovering, survival, and emotional support. Neanderthals acknowledge that they did both. However, we can also learn about their lifestyles from the frequency of these injuries. These were not individuals who foraged delicately or hunted tiny wildlife from afar. They were directly confronted with danger. The majority of their weapons were thrusting spears. Instead of throwing, think stab, and the animal frequently fights back when you hunt in that manner. The next time you trip over a rug and feel sorry for yourself, keep in mind that Neanderthals survived by inventing personal grooming while spending their life being pummeled by Ice Age death machines. They also brushed it off with fire and moss. Resilience, huh? Neanderthals were not merely Ice Age survivors. They added fire to it, which is essentially the ancient equivalent of saying, "Winter, not today, Satan." They certainly knew how to create, manage, and use fire in ways that would have made a caveman Bear Grylls nod in agreement, even if they weren't out there tossing fireballs or creating s'mores. How are we aware of this? Hearths, centered fire pits with charred bones, heated stones, and layers of ash occasionally accumulated over years in the same location are clearly visible at archaeological sites. There's more to that wildfire than meets the eye. A Neanderthal would have picked a pleasant spot, built a fire, and then prepared meals beside it, all the while likely scowling at the wind. The widely held belief is that they employed techniques such as striking pyrite and flint to produce a spark that could light dry moss or grass. There were no lighters, matches, or YouTube guides, just a mysterious mound of rocks and unadulterated resolve. Hold my beer throughout the Ice Age. They also used fire for purposes other than heating. They cooked food with fire, which facilitated chewing and digestion. It was more than just a gastronomic enhancement. Additionally, it decreased parasites, released more nutrients, and might have allowed them more time to create other beneficial things, like gossip. The advantage of tool-making comes next. Neanderthals may have been practicing thermal engineering before humans even found out how to create useless committees, because heating flint makes it easier to nap or shape into implements. Not to be overlooked is defense. Predators are scared of fire. In addition to warmth and light, sitting by a fire provided a makeshift force barrier to protect against anything that might snarl in the shadows. Imagine a group of prehistoric people preparing meals, sharing tales, and creating menacing shadows on the cave walls. Their home security system was fire. Did they discover fire before anyone else? Most likely not. However, they did it in their own steady, pragmatic, and remarkably laid-back manner. They didn't show it off. They just quietly turned cold caves into livable homes and meat into slightly less chewy meat. YouTube how-tos, screwdrivers, and multi-tools were not available to Neanderthals. They would, however, create a tool set that could skin a deer, construct a shelter, and perhaps crack open a bottle of medieval wine if they were given a piece of flint and some quiet time. They used more than simply sharp rocks as tools. They were purposefully designed tools with meticulous attention to detail and precisely the proper amount of restrained violence. The main method they employed, a complex multi-step procedure called the Levallois method, entails preparing a stone core so that flakes can be extracted in a predictable shape. To put it another way, they weren't merely hammering rocks together like little children. They were so meticulous in their design, core shape, angle analysis, and cutting that contemporary archaeologists occasionally confuse their work for early Homo sapiens workmanship, which must be frustrating to them. Neanderthal tools included scrapers, points, awls, borers, and even hafted tools, which were blades fastened to wooden shafts with sinew and tree glue. It's not merely a sharp item. They employed these tools for everything, which is a form of prehistoric composite engineering: woodworking, tanning hides, butchering meat, and perhaps the odd outburst of rage. And let's face it, anyone who can use tree goo and patience to glue stone to stick deserves a TED Talk. Additionally, their toolkits differed by locale. Accordingly, Neanderthals weren't merely imitating one another. By modifying their techniques to suit local resources, climates, and animals, they were innovating. One group may utilize flint, another limestone. It appears that some even tried using tools made of bone and antler. It is comparable to Etsy in antiquity. Furthermore, they had no fear of progress. Their tools became increasingly sophisticated, effective, and possibly lethal over time. Evolution was not at work here. It was practice and brains. Most people think of Neanderthals as grunting beings bent over a fire, holding a club in one hand while their supper is still twitching in the other. The archaeological record, however, presents a different picture. One in which the same individuals who could chop up a reindeer in 5 minutes also took the time to adorn a shell or lay flowers in the grave of a loved one. Neanderthals did really possess civilization, and not only the type that develops on rotting meat. Let we begin with funerals. Intentional graves, frequently in small pits, are found at several Neanderthal sites. Occasionally, grave objects or pollen traces are found, indicating that flowers may have been interred with the deceased. We may never know if this was a spiritual, metaphorical, or simply ancient form of "he liked plants." What matters is that they were concerned. They wept. Grandma wasn't simply thrown behind a boulder and left. Then there is the art. For many years it was believed that Neanderthals were not artists. We were meant to do that. Then, more than 64,000 years ago, we discovered red ochre cave drawings in Spain. That was before modern humans arrived in Europe, to give you a hint. The unpleasant quiet you hear is the result of anthropology professors confidently re-evaluating what they have said. Neanderthals also gathered ornamental items, feathers, perforated shells, and eagle talons, items that had no apparent utilitarian use unless they were secretly creating costumes. Some might have served as social cues, ritual items, or decorations. In any case, they were more than merely survival. They have to do with purpose. Deep beneath in France, there is even a mystery cave structure composed of fractured stalagmites arranged in rings. Neanderthals, 176,000 years ago, creating in the dark as if they were calling out something, or perhaps just being strange, with no sunlight, no obvious purpose, and no graffiti. Who knows? We also cannot overlook language. They possessed genes linked to language processing as well as the hyoid bone, which is essential for speech. It's safe to assume that they weren't merely grunting, even though they might not have written poetry. One Neanderthal once glanced at another and murmured something significant, most likely referring to meat, but nevertheless significant. Let's discuss your main area of interest. Indeed, there was a romantic, biblical, and DNA-testable relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans. Around 60,000 years ago, early humans migrated into Europe and Asia and encountered the Neanderthals. Instead of treating them like distant cousins at a wedding, they asked them, "You up?" Without irony. Because it is actually encoded in our genes, we are aware that this occurred. 1 to 4% of non-African individuals now have Neanderthal DNA, meaning that somewhere in your lineage, one of your very, very, very great-grandparents had a wild date night during the ice period. Was it affection? A plan for survival? The gene pool isn't that large, but that's the prehistoric equivalent. Scientists continue to argue. It's likely that some interactions were voluntary, while others weren't. Although it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what prehistoric romance looked like, we do know that it left genetic traces that can still be seen in things like skin tone, immune system characteristics, and perhaps your aversion to cilantro. It's also noteworthy that this wasn't an isolated incident. It seems obvious that there was more than one confused Homo sapiens at a very dark cave party, because genetic evidence indicates that interbreeding occurred several times, in several locations, spanning thousands of years, and it wasn't all going in one way. We will never know if the Neanderthals were more impressed by conversational skills or fire-starting abilities, but it appears that males and females of the Homo sapiens species interacted more often. This could be because of the sheer charm of early human travel tales and slightly better cheekbones. We do know, however, that no blended superspecies was produced as a result of this mixing. Though they eventually vanished, we nevertheless carry elements of the Neanderthals with us. Your nose a little wide? That might have been a gift from Neanderthals. Your dislike of cardio and love of red meat. Suspicious, too. According to statistics, you may be partially Neanderthal, so before you mock them for their enormous eyebrows or dubious fashion choices, you should probably look at your ancestry record. It's science, no offense intended. We now know that most non-African people carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, thanks to genome sequencing and the tireless efforts of geneticists with powerful microscopes and too much coffee. That means if you're watching this, your great-great-great-great-great-grandparent wore fur and didn't blink during snowstorms. Congratulations. This old inheritance isn't just a strange anecdote. It manifests itself in tangible ways. You're a little bit Ice Age. To begin with, Neanderthal genes have been connected to characteristics such as immunological response, skin tone, hair texture, and even pain sensitivity. Accordingly, you might carry the Neanderthal version of human firmware if you get sunburned easily, react oddly to allergens, or feel like you've been shot after stubbling your toe. Neanderthal DNA has even been shown to influence how people sleep, digest fat, and react to specific drugs. According to some research, it may have an impact on mood regulation. This means that while your propensity for brooding and overall grumpiness during the winter may be genetically warranted, there is some bad news. Additionally, certain Neanderthal gene variations have been connected to diseases like depression, nicotine addiction, and type 2 diabetes. Your ancient cousins may have saved your life during a woolly mammoth onslaught, but they may also share some of the blame for your impulsive snacking and doom-scrolling at 2 in the morning. The human family tree is less of a neat chart and more of a tangled, romantically chaotic shrub. It is also important to note that African populations whose ancestors did not interbreed with Neanderthals after migrating out of Africa have little to no Neanderthal DNA, but they do have traces of other archaic humans, such as the Denisovans. Throughout their roughly 300,000-year existence, Neanderthals survived cold ages, saber-toothed predators, and one another. They were the real natives, the first Europeans. Then they silently disappeared about 40,000 years ago, just fade to black, no comet, no dramatic extinction event, as if they hadn't been warned to stay for the Holocene. What then took place? Climate change is one theory. Neanderthals found it difficult to adjust to new surroundings as the previous ice age started to change. Large wildlife became scarce, their hunting areas shifted, and even mammoths began to act out. There were more existential crises and fewer summertime vibes for a group that was designed to rule the cold, warming weather. Competition with Homo sapiens is another possibility. Long-distance weapons, more diverse foods, and that incredibly bothersome habit of surviving everywhere were all brought to Europe by modern humans. They may have spoken more, traveled farther, and reproduced more quickly. It is very important in a species conflict. Neanderthals were probably outnumbered as well. Less genetic diversity resulted from their smaller and more isolated populations. A major issue when your neighbors are reproducing like it's a competitive sport, and every winter is a survival game show. And yet, this wasn't a violent takeover. No significant evidence of warfare or genocide has been found. For thousands of years, Neanderthals and humans lived side by side, exchanged DNA, exchanged ideas, and perhaps had some awkward conversations over campfires. Eventually, there were no more pure Neanderthal groups. Like the last embers of a candle, the last Neanderthals probably resided in southern Iberia, in areas like Gibraltar, where they persisted for a few thousand years longer. The archaeological record becomes silent. Just silence, no fresh tools, no new burials. This was not a failure, however. It was a chapter that had a lasting impact. Despite their lackluster demise, Neanderthals' influence endures, not in scrolls or monuments, but in blood, bones, and DNA. They remained intact, they were taken in. Neanderthals suffered the most during the majority of modern history. In terms of public relations, not biology, the initial targets of negative publicity were them. Scientists were uncertain about the meaning of the first Neanderthal remains when they were found in the middle of the 1800s. The limbs were strangely thick, as if someone had taken a regular person and put them through a bulk filter, and the brow ridges were enormous despite the skull's human-like appearance. Victorian scientists quickly labeled them brutish, primitive, and likely terrible at dinner conversation. The legend of the crouching, grunting caveman was born, part monstrous, part obnoxious uncle. It didn't help that the word Neanderthal was used. It sounded like something that may throw stones at goats and live beneath a bridge. They also suffered from early reconstructions. One well-known portrayal, which, spoiler alert, was based on an elderly person with arthritis, featured a Neanderthal standing like a gorilla, with no neck and a 1,000-yard gaze. It would be like making generalizations about all people based on someone's great-grandfather while experiencing a backache. The picture remained. The stereotype was reinforced in textbooks, movies, and cartoons. a club-wielding idiot with dubious posture. The fact that Neanderthals used tools, buried their dead, made art, and perhaps wore jewelry was subtly disregarded in favor of grunts and loincloths. Why did we take this action? Most likely because it gave us a sense of superiority. People enjoy hearing a compelling tale about how we were the only ones, the wise ones, or the selected ones. We can maintain that narrative by reducing Neanderthals to failed prototypes. It also made any awkward genetic overlap easier to explain. We're connected, of course, but we're superior, right? The myth has just recently started to fall apart. We have to acknowledge that Neanderthals were more like us than not, as more archaeological findings come to light. They weren't mistakes. They were a parallel success. Different strategies, same struggle. A woman had no place on the battlefield during the war-torn twilight of Japan's Heian period, but that's exactly where Tomoe Gozen should have been. Imagine a sea of armored troops engaged in steel-on-steel combat in the turmoil and dust of battle, with one figure standing out from the crowd. She was more accurate, more brave, and more skillful than the majority of the warriors around her, not because she was out of place. Tomoe Gozen was no mere noblewoman or camp follower playing at war. From the province of Echigo, she was Onimusha, a skilled fighter. She learned to ride, shoot a bow from a horse, and wield a katana so fiercely that she left men twice her size bleeding in the mud at an early age. She was loyal to Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a well-known Minamoto clan general. But don't be misled, Tomoe wasn't only his ornament or protector, she was his equal, his commander, and his enforcer. According to modern sources, she was a strikingly attractive woman with long hair, white complexion, and endearing features. The praise wasn't limited to her appearance either. They talked of her power, her unparalleled swordsmanship, and her remarkable archery skills. Nor was this court gossip or poetry. It was a fact of life on the battlefield. She was capable of breaking through ranks, beheading an opponent in the middle of a gallop, and continuing to ride without even tripping. The timing of Tomoe Gozen's ascent was no accident. She was a storm in human form. The Genpei War, a civil war between the Taira and Minamoto clans over control of the imperial throne, was tearing Japan apart. They were rewriting feudal codes, the class of samurai was growing, and in this void of chaos and order, Tomoe Gozen established a place on the front lines that no woman had ever dared to claim. She did more than fight. She led troops. She prevailed in a duel. Like any warrior demonstrating their kill, she carried heads back to camp. Above all, she disregarded the meticulously outlined boundaries of what it meant to be a woman in Japan in the 12th century. Tomoe Gozen was no different. She was a revelation, a cautionary tale, and the beginning of a legend. Tomoe Gozen had to learn how to survive in a world designed to keep her out before she ever saw combat. In feudal Japan, there was a strong emphasis on honor, hierarchy, and strict boundaries, particularly for women. Samurai's daughters were supposed to be quiet, obedient, and courteous. However, Tomoe had a very unusual upbringing. Although her exact birth date is unknown, it is believed that she was born in the late Heian period into a family of minor samurai. According to certain reports, she might have grown up in Minamoto no Yoshinaka's own home. It is still up for contention whether she was his valued retainer, foster sister, or concubine. Her skill, however, is undeniable. That didn't just show up, that was deserved. Tomoe would have had to repeatedly demonstrate that she was capable of doing everything they could, and more, while young boys were given swords and instructed in the Bushido code. She would have received harsh training. Strength was only one aspect of swordsmanship. Timing, control, and reading your opponent were key. She would have learned how to fight in heavy armor, control a warhorse at full gallop, and practice kenjutsu for blade work and kyudo for archery. She probably picked up the nagintata, a curved-bladed polearm traditionally used by female warriors during the few times of calm. Do not be misled, however, by this symbolic ceremonial ritual. This was a prelude to actual conflict. Tomoe didn't only keep up with the men, her fighting style was a combination of elegance and lethality. She frequently outperformed them. Isolation characterized this stage of her life prior to the conflicts and the stories. Swords were not carried by most ladies. In strategy sessions, the majority of women remained silent. Furthermore, it was not anticipated that most women would survive long on the battlefield. However, Tomoe had everything revolve around her. Every ability she acquired had to be twice as lethal, twice as accurate, and twice as sharp as those of her male peers, because no one would consider her failure to be a soldier's error. It is referred to as a woman's weakness. Therefore, Tomoe Gozen had to make her mark on the world, blade by blade, day by day, in quiet and shadow, before she could ever write her name in the annals of history, by sheer will, not by invitation. Upon Tomoe Gozen's adulthood, Japan was in danger of collapsing. In 1180, a savage civil war broke out between the Minamoto and Taira clans, known as the Genpei War. It was more than just an army conflict. It completely changed the balance of power in the nation. The warrior class was poised to take over history, and emperors were being moved like chess pieces. Tomoe too. She was in the center of it all. The more well-known Minamoto no Yoritomo was distantly related to her master and potential lover, Minamoto no Yoshinaka. Yoshinaka, however, wasn't happy to remain in the background like Yoritomo was. He desired authority over the Minamoto clan, over Kyoto, and over the whole nation. And he didn't think twice when war started. He started his expedition southward after building his own force in the northern provinces. Tomoe Gozen was right next to him. She wasn't merely a ceremonial warrior to display in court. Tomoe led soldiers into combat. She made calculated choices. She was at the front lines with her blade out, giving orders that most men wouldn't dare to dispute when the fighting got brutal. She represented Yoshinaka's boldness, his will to break with convention and succeed by any means necessary. The Battle of Genpei was brutal. Battles were fought through mountains, on rivers, and in forests. The ground was covered in blood from hand-to-hand fighting, and arrows fell like monsoon showers. During the Battle of Yokotogawara, Tomoe is said to have led a charge that destroyed enemy forces, one of her most well-known triumphs. According to chronicles, she presented the heads of a number of warriors as prizes. It was not for show. It served as evidence. Every head was a message, and every kill was a receipt. But glory wasn't the only reason for war. It has to do with devotion and treachery. Tensions with Yoritomo increased as Yoshinaka ascended to power because he perceived his cousin's ambition as a danger. Already broken by vanity and pride, the Minamoto clan started to turn inward. On paper, the Taira was still the adversary, but Yoshinaka now had to keep an eye on his back. Ever devoted, Tomoe remained nearby. Politics, however, was too tough for even the most powerful blade, and the pressure increased along with the fight. On Tomoe's historical position as well as Yoshinaka's claim to authority, Yoshinaka's ambition outstripped his alliances as the Genpei War continued. Following a string of outstanding military triumphs, he accomplished what many believed was impossible in 1183. He seized power at the imperial palace and expelled the Taira from Kyoto. He was Japan's most powerful guy at the time. As usual, Tomoe Gozen stood by his side, triumphant, devoted, and covered in blood. However, power has two sides. The emperor and court nobility soon saw that Yoshinaka was as unmanageable as the battle he waged, Despite his desire of re-establishing imperial power, he ravaged the city, enraged the elite of Kyoto, and started taking actions that even his Minamoto found troubling. Worst of all, he attempted to seize power from Emperor Go-Shirakawa, a symbolic gesture of absolute power that would spell his political demise. The Minamoto faction's de facto head, Minamoto no Yoritomo, swiftly condemned the deed. He sent 2 faithful generals, Minamoto no Noriori and the renowned Minamoto no Yoshitsune, to kill Yoshinaka after declaring him a traitor. With the start of the Minamoto Civil War, Tomoe Gozen was suddenly engaged in combat with her own clan rather than the Taira. The plunge that ensued was swift and terrible. Once the audacious and careless newcomer, Yoshinaka, was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. With Tomoe and a few other devoted retainers, he withdrew from Kyoto. Early in 1184, during the Battle of Owazu, they made their last stand. It would be a last-ditch effort for honor rather than glory. Tomoe battled like a devil on fire as the enemies drew closer. According to chronicles, she immediately killed the strongest warrior she could find after charging into the enemy lines and rode back through the chaos. It was a message as much as a skill. She would not be destroyed, even in defeat. Yoshinaka, however, knew it was over. According to legend, he asked Tomoe to leave the battlefield because it would be humiliating for a samurai general to die with a woman, not because he didn't think she was brave. The irony was awful. To preserve his legend, the most ferocious warrior by his side was being fired. Was she compliant? Yes, according to certain sources. Some claim she disappeared into combat and was never heard from again. In any case, Yoshinaka's downfall marked the end of an era and the start of a myth. The battlefield was covered in snow. In February of 1184, the Owazu plains were peaceful, too peaceful for the impending violent storm. Once a conqueror of Kyoto, Minamoto no Yoshinaka was now a fugitive of his own clan and stood with only a few dozen warriors remaining. His last stand had arrived, and Tomoe Gozen, who had always been by his side, was not going to let him pass away alone. The chances were bleak. They were under attack from hundreds of enemy fighters under the command of Yoshitsune and Noriori. Their horses kicked up frozen earth, and their armor shone. And Tomoe Gozen pulled her sword, adjusted her helmet, and charged into legend despite the freezing winds. Heike Monogatari, who lived in the 14th century, claims that Tomoe did not flee. Like a tornado, she charged ahead in search of the most formidable foe she could locate. A well-known fighter in his own right was Hatakeyama Shigetada. Tomoe did not wait for introductions, whether in rage, desperation, or a refusal to die in silence. In one seamless action, she unseated him, locked swords, and severed his skull. One last trophy. This was samurai ethics in action, not simply spectacle, to prove oneself against insurmountable obstacles, to fight to the end, and to die gracefully. Additionally, it was the event that would characterize Tomoe for decades to come. This one deed became her battle cry that reverberated through the ages, told and reinvented by many generations. Yoshinaka, meantime, was knocked down by a barrage of arrows after his horse became caught in a rice paddy. Imai Kanahira, his faithful companion, took his own life in a spectacular manner by jumping from his horse and putting his sword in his mouth. The inner circle of the warlord had been smothered. The records, however, diverge here. Tomoe. According to one account, Yoshinaka, fearing the embarrassment of dying with a woman, gave her the order to leave before he passed away. She resisted, fought her way out, and disappeared into the mountains, according to others. Others claim she was taken prisoner, coerced into marrying an enemy general, and then converted to nunhood. These ends have not been verified. However, one thing is for sure. She did not surrender in her final deed at Owazu. It was a rebellious one. Tomoe Gozen did not simply vanish. On the strength of one flawless, enraged last charge, she rose to fame. As though she rode off the battlefield and into folklore, Tomoe Gozen disappeared from the official records following the blood-soaked snows of Owazu. It is impossible for any historian to state for sure what happened to her. And maybe that's appropriate. Tomoe and other warriors were not meant to live. Their honor, their sword, and their lord were to be with them when they died. However, Tomoe, perhaps she made a far more defiant decision to survive. Our primary source on Tomoe's life, the Heike Monogatari, presents contradictory accounts. According to one, she was taken prisoner and made to wed Wada Yoshimori, a commander under Yoritomo. After giving birth to a child, she withdrew from the world of politics and steel to become a nun. According to a different story, she chopped off her long warrior's hair, changed her name, and disappeared into Nagano's mountain monasteries. She continued to roam the countryside as an unaligned warrior, or ronin, according to yet another tale, hired for borderland conflicts and private retaliation. Then there was quiet. It lasted for centuries. The truth might never come to light since it is hidden beneath oral histories, scrolls, and folklore. However, Tomoe's disappearance became a part of her strength. She became immortal by disappearing from history. One ending, one function, or one interpretation of femininity no longer bound her. Rather, she turned into a representation of hope. How Japan changed without her is what adds to the mystery of her story. The Kamakura period, a strict patriarchal time when women were progressively marginalized, began with the establishment of the shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo. Although they didn't entirely disappear, female warriors were marginalized, idealized, or ignored more and more. Nevertheless, Tomoe persisted, possibly not in the dusty records of official history, but rather in the tales mothers told their daughters and soldiers muttered over campfires. She turned into a ghost that tormented the ideal of the warrior, the woman who had no superiors, yet fought like 10 men. Over time, poets, playwrights, and painters resurrected her, sometimes as a tragic lover, sometimes as an avenging demon, sometimes as the last true samurai, but always as a figure who defied expectations and left a trail of mystery behind her. The silence that Tomoe Gozen left behind echoes louder than any death scene because she changed rather than simply disappeared. As the ages went by, the lady who had once been feared on the battlefield changed completely, becoming a mythology shaped by playwrights, poets, and monks. In a time when women were supposed to be invisible, Tomoe Gozen made a lasting impression. She was originally inscribed in cultural memory in the 13th century Heike Monogatari, a vast semi-historical battle epic. However, this work was never only a history book, it was theatre and performance. Blind monks known as biwa hoshi went from town to town, repeating the history of the Genpei War to the music of the biwa lute. Their voices brought Tomoe Gozen back to life as a tragic heroine as well as a fighter. She was considerably embellished in later translations. In No and Kabuki theatre, Tomoe became a reoccurring figure. Her conflicts were perfectly styled, her devotion was emphasized, and her attractiveness was accentuated. She was often associated with fatal love stories, painful farewells, and moral messages about honor and duty. Not only did the crowds watch her battle, but they also cried for her, respected her, and frightened her in equal measure. However, there was a price for this romanticization. Slowly, the actual woman, the one who led cavalry attacks and beheaded enemies, became softer. Her armor was eventually exchanged for flowing kimonos. Her swordplay became metaphors for feminine resilience. She became tamed, respectable, and palatable. And yet, her image refused to die. During the Edo period, artists depicted her riding into battle with her blade poised and her visage composed. Samurai guides placed her in lists of martial paragons. Her name was invoked by sword schools. Her story retained the abrasive edge of the battlefield despite being mythologized. Tomoe Gozen is frequently cited with other legendary warriors like Musashi, Benkei, and Yoshitsune in contemporary Japan. But unlike them, she carries the particular weight of gender resistance. She was a challenge to the rule rather than merely an exception. Since then, women have turned to Tomoe as evidence that they can stand wherever they want, even in the middle of the battlefield. The further she strayed from actuality, the closer she grew to symbol. A lady who shouldn't have existed, yet did. An uncontainable fighter who persevered, and a tale that would not stop. Even though Tomoe Gozen's blade was sheathed more than 800 years ago, her legacy endures, ingrained in Japanese and other cultures' collective consciousness. She developed into more than simply a Genpei War icon as the generations went by. She came to represent defiance, uniqueness, and the disruptive force of a woman who doesn't fit the mold. Tomoe's image served as both a source of inspiration and a warning throughout the Edo era, when samurai culture was codified and ritualized into a rigid code of conduct. Some considered her as an embodiment of ideal loyalty, a warrior who served her king to the last end. Others viewed her as a dangerous outlier, demonstrating that when women deviate from their assigned roles, mayhem ensues, particularly in patriarchal academic settings. She could not be eliminated, however, even by those who feared her. By the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, when Japan strove to modernize and define its national character, Tomoe re-emerged in textbooks and public debate, this time as a patriotic heroine. She frequently co-starred with male warrior legends in children's novels, school performances, and nationalistic artwork. The representation was cleaned up, but it was still there. The canon now included a female warrior. Over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, Tomoe's legacy also changed. She became a popular topic among feminist historians, video game developers, manga artists, and filmmakers. As a woman whose fame was founded on combat rather than romance, Tomoe stood out in a media landscape filled with cliched characters. She wasn't the abandoned lover, she was the one who grabbed up the sword and fought ahead. The way Tomoe is portrayed today reflects changing sentiments. Some cast her as a feminist icon, others as a tragic figure of unfulfilled destiny. She is portrayed by some as a warrior spirit that haunts battlegrounds. She is always powerful, always nuanced, and always just out of comprehension, regardless of how it is interpreted. Even in politics and education, Tomoe Gozen has become shorthand for disobedience. She is honored with school names. She is mentioned in martial arts dojos' genealogy. She appears on stamps, posters, and even anime stories, her name used whenever someone wants to explain that a warrior's soul can come in any form. Even though she only served in one conflict, her presence inspires people to fight for justice, identity, and location. Never once did Tomoe Gozen request to be remembered. She left no letters, no memoirs, no poetic insights. She left behind a legacy etched in fire, loyalty, and blood, the only thing that really counted to a warrior of her era. And in doing so, she achieved something few in history ever manage: immortality without asking for it. Tomoe was not preserved because she conformed to social norms, in contrast to many women of her era. She was preserved because she broke them. She changed the rules of feudal Japan each time she wielded her blade in a battlefield full of men who didn't think she was worthy. Even though she disappeared into obscurity, her story was only made louder by her absence. In a society where a woman's value was frequently determined by her silence, Tomoe's stillness, following Owazu, has taken on a life of its own. Generations of artists, academics and revolutionaries have been able to fill the hole with significance because there are no hard facts about her destiny. She is now the epitome of possibility and evidence that it is possible to flout convention and still become a legend. Her name endures not only in literature and popular culture, but also in the spirit of every athlete who pushes herself to the limit, every combatant who doesn't wait for approval to stand her ground, every leader who is told she's too aggressive, and every woman who refuses to be invisible. There is more to Tomoe Gozen than just history. She's a standard-bearer of defiance, shrouded in silence. In Nagano and throughout Japan, sculptures of her are still in place today. She is studied in history classrooms by schoolgirls. At anime conventions, cosplayers dress up as her persona. As they practice with the naginata, martial artists whisper her name. She even appears in foreign games and programs, reminding worldwide audiences that the archetype of the female warrior isn't fiction, it's history. However, the fact that we still don't fully understand her might be her greatest strength. Was she a former concubine who became a general? A foster daughter raised in the art of war? That was the lone ronin that ventured into the mountains and never returned. Perhaps that is the point, even though we may never discover the whole truth. One narrative was never intended for Tomoe Gozen. She was destined to be numerous, unrecorded, and unaffected by time, simply riding into the legend she created for herself with her sword, drawn forever. Ancient seafarers gazed out over vast horizons and posed the most audacious inquiry of all. What's out there? That was before satellites lit up the sky and compasses pointed north. They were navigators, engineers, and dreamers, not careless idiots. And they built sea routes that would serve as the first conduits of international connectivity, using just the stars above and the winds in their sails. Tens of thousands of years ago, humanity and the sea first interacted. Long before the agricultural revolution more than 40,000 years ago, there was some of the oldest traces of watercraft. Even then, early humans were already utilizing rafts to reach distant islands like Australia, which meant crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean. These were not accidental incidents, they were planned excursions, made with a good awareness of tides, winds, and celestial patterns. Maritime technology was thriving by 3000 BCE. Cultures in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and along the Nile were already employing boats for trade and fishing. However, true oceanic navigation didn't start until some societies ventured out to sea. These early seamen had to overcome several obstacles. No written directions, no maps, and frequently no assurance that they would ever return. Nevertheless, motivated by survival, curiosity, and necessity, they went. Like a book, they read the waves, they saw how the stars moved across the sky, how birds flew at specific times of the day, and how clouds formed over islands. Specifically, the night sky turned become their most useful instrument. An example of a fixed point for orientation was the Northern Hemisphere's Polaris. Navigators in the Southern Hemisphere kept an eye on the Southern Cross. Under their hulls, these sailors developed the ability to sense the subtle push of currents. The sound of the wind on their sails was something they learned. Most astonishingly, they used chants, songs, and holy customs to transmit this knowledge orally for centuries. They did not use astrolabes or compasses. They used intuition, recollection, and observation as tools. It was more than just survival. Before science had a name, it was science, a method of understanding the world that combined culture and nature. Furthermore, these ancient mariners were doing more than simply navigating oceans when they started out across uncharted waters. They were establishing the first links between civilizations that had never even heard of one another's names, as well as the groundwork for international trade and migration. One of the most advanced seafaring civilizations the ancient world had ever seen existed on the island of Crete, long before Athens or Rome rose to prominence. Minoans. The Minoans, who flourished between 2000 and 1450 BCE, were more than merely islanders. The sea was transformed into a superhighway of culture, trade, and power by these marine architects. The city of Knossos, a vast palace complex with colorful murals of dolphins, ships, and marine life, was the center of Minoan authority. These weren't ornamental adornments, they were proclamations. The sea was the lifeblood of the Minoans. Their influence reached Egypt, the Levant, and other parts of the Aegean, and their economy flourished on maritime trade. Minoan ships were built for speed and stability, making them perfect for trade and diplomatic missions, in contrast to later Greek navies that were constructed for war. They utilized square sails and rowers to cross the placid yet erratic Mediterranean, and their boats were frequently adorned with bull or bird themes. These vessels transported everything from bronze and earthenware to wine and olive oil. The Minoans spread ideas, art, religion, and technologies like waves throughout the Aegean, but they brought more than just things. How did they manage to navigate? Archaeologists think the Minoans used a combination of visual markers and star-based navigation, even though there are no surviving Minoan nautical charts. Bird flight routes, watercolor, and coastal headlands. Long before they were documented, their frequent returns from protracted travels indicate a profound awareness of seasonal winds and maritime patterns. Their contribution to the creation of the Greek alphabet is among the most striking indications of Minoan maritime skill. The Minoans contributed to the development of one of the most significant scripts in history by engaging with Near Eastern societies such as the Phoenicians. Their ships were floating platforms for cultural interaction rather than only transporting goods. However, the ocean they mastered might have been the source of their demise, as is the case with many sea-based powers. It is possible that a volcanic explosion on the nearby island of Thera, which is now part of Santorini, about 1450 BCE caused ash clouds and tsunamis that destroyed Minoan ports and undermined their authority. Their ships finally vanished from the waves, whether via invasion or natural causes. But more than just ruins were left by the Minoans. They left a legacy of what it meant to dominate by sea rather than land. The Phoenicians were the sea's tireless business people, if the Minoans were its artists. The Phoenicians, a loose confederation of city-states including Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, ruled the eastern Mediterranean from approximately 1500 BCE to 300 BCE. They did it with fleets rather than armies. Their legacy is one of trade, navigation, and the dissemination of civilization throughout the known world rather than empires and conquests. There was no big capital or cohesive kingdom among the Phoenicians. What they possessed were numerous ships. These were streamlined, swift, and incredibly agile ships that could conduct long-distance commerce. Their ships could dart across open sea or hug coasts using banks of oars and square sails. They brought glass, cedar wood, purple dye, and most crucially, ideas. They served as the ancient world's go-betweens, connecting North Africa with the Western Mediterranean, Greece with Mesopotamia, and Egypt with Anatolia. They founded colonies and outposts along the coasts, most notably Carthage in North Africa, which would eventually become a rival to Rome. With the mother towns back east benefiting from trans-Mediterranean trade, each colony functioned as a node in a huge maritime network. But without a compass or sextant, how were they able to sail such vast distances? The Phoenicians, like their Minoan forebears, relied on the stars for guidance, especially Polaris, the North Star. They also comprehended current behavior, coastline features, and dominant wind patterns. They are credited by several academics with creating one of the earliest celestial navigation systems in the Western world. However, the alphabet which they created was their biggest contribution, rather than anything they carried. With only 22 letters that represented sounds rather than whole words or syllables, the Phoenician writing system, which was created in 1050 BCE, was a significant advancement. The Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek alphabets were all influenced by this character. The Phoenicians connected rather than just traded thanks to their language innovation and their maritime perseverance. By connecting cultures, languages, and economies, they transformed the sea from a barrier into a bridge. And they accomplished this by sailing from one heart and mind to another, rather than by colonizing them. The Mediterranean was their identity, not just a route. A completely different maritime tale was taking place on the other side of the planet, while Phoenician traders and Greek triremes were thriving in the Mediterranean world. The world's greatest ocean was traversed by outriggers, double-hulled canoes, and stars. Without the use of metal tools, maps, or written language, these Austronesian mariners not only sailed the oceans, but also settled half of the planet's surface. Around 3000 BCE, the Austronesians began in what is now Taiwan and gradually spread eastward and southward, moving incredibly quickly from island to island. They had arrived in Indonesia, the Philippines, and the outskirts of New Guinea by 1500 BCE. They were in Melanesia and Micronesia by 1000 BCE. By the early centuries of the Common Era, they had traveled over 10,000 miles in an arc of human migration, reaching as far east as Easter Island and as far west as Madagascar. Their ships were engineering wonders. For stability, the Austronesians created outrigger canoes, which were later followed by double-hulled voyaging canoes that could transport people, goods, and animals over thousands of miles of open sea. They utilized paddles for accuracy close to islands and crab-claw sails to harness wind. But their unmatched navigational ability was what really made them stand out. The sun, moon, planets, and around 200 stars served as their guides. However, that is only the start. The ocean served as a living map for Austronesian navigators, particularly the renowned Polynesian wayfinders. They were able to identify minute variations in wave patterns brought on by far-off islands reflecting surges. They investigated cloud formations, tracked the flight paths of seabirds, and even tasted seawater to detect changes in salinity close to land. This was highly developed science that was transmitted orally, through charts and memory aids. It was not instinct. Their migration was deliberate and repeated rather than the result of haphazard discovery. Their journey across the Pacific is marked by lapita pottery, a unique cultural artifact that demonstrates how intertwined their culture was. Not all of them were island hoppers. They established civilizations everywhere they went, bringing with them technology, languages, and agriculture. And they still are, in many respects. The sophistication and breadth of Austronesian navigation are still being revealed by contemporary genetic research, linguistics, and archaeology. These seafarers accomplished more than simply traverse oceans. Long before European explorers ever left port, they linked some of the world's most isolated regions. The sea was never empty in the Pacific. It served as a roadmap. Towering pyramids and desert tombs, not ships, are typically what we think of when we think of ancient Egypt. Water, however, was nothing new to the Egyptians. Their first school of navigation, their highway, and their lifeline was the Nile. However, it is frequently forgotten that the Egyptians' marine influence extended well beyond the riverbanks, reaching the Red Sea, and perhaps even farther. Egypt was the first to master the Nile. They constructed enormous wooden boats as early as 3000 BCE, using boards that were bound together with rope and sealed with resin. These boats, which were driven by both sails and oars, were crucial for moving grain, troops, and merchandise over the wide expanses of the river. However, the Nile was just the start. Egypt was starting maritime missions from Red Sea ports by the 15th century BCE, when Pharaoh Hatshepsut ruled. In ancient maritime history, her renowned journey to the enigmatic land of Punt, possibly in present-day Somalia, Eritrea, or southern Arabia, was a turning point. Large freight ships laden with exotic animals, incense trees and gold are depicted in detail in reliefs from her funeral temple at Deir el-Bahari. The ships are returning from a successful maritime voyage. These drifts were no accident. They were well-planned missions that took into account seasonal scheduling, monsoon wind patterns and currents. In addition to using star patterns for navigation and maritime scouts, Egyptian sailors would have hugged coastlines and possibly even recruited talented local sailors from the Red Sea region. Particularly during the height of Mesopotamian Indus-Egyptian interaction, some hypotheses even propose that Egyptians had indirect sea contact with the Indus Valley. Items like ivory, lapis lazuli, and spices suggest a larger Indian Ocean trading network in which Egypt might have participated, despite the paucity of direct evidence. For their day, the ships themselves were engineering wonders. Large square sails and curved hulls were characteristics of Egyptian seafaring vessels, which were constructed primarily from cedar wood imported from Lebanon. These vessels could endure the Red Sea's swells and transport large loads. Despite never achieving the Phoenicians' level of maritime dominance, the Egyptians left behind a significant legacy. They were among the first to view marine expeditions as strategic, holy, and regal undertakings. Their maritime expeditions served as extensions of their heavenly might, empire, and diplomacy. Pyramids were constructed on land, but ambition was launched on sea. One of the oldest urban civilizations in history, the Harappans or Indus Valley Civilization, flourished on the arid plains of present-day Pakistan and northwest India. Between 2600 and 1900 BCE, they flourished and constructed cities with uniform bricks, sophisticated sanitation, and impressive urban design. Beneath this archaeological genius, however, lies another truth, one that is less well known but no less important. The Harappans were traders on the seas. The Harappans left behind no great naval reliefs, deciphered writing, or epic stories of sea expeditions in contrast to Egypt or Mesopotamia. However, the archaeological record is subtly dotted with indications of their seafaring skill. What many consider to be one of the oldest known dockyards in the world was discovered during excavations at Lothal, a significant Harappan port city in Gujarat. Its two 18-meter-length floodgates and channels, as well as its connection to an old river that flowed to the Arabian Sea, demonstrate that Harappan engineers were considering both the interior and the exterior. The rest of the story is told via artifacts. Mesopotamia, more especially the Sumerian city of Ur and Lagash, is home to Harappan seals and artifacts, including ceramics, beads, and ivory. According to Akkadian writings, boats brought unique products from a far-off place named Meluha, which is probably the Indus Valley. Silver, tin, and lapis lazuli were sent to the Harappans in exchange, indicating a sophisticated trading network extending from the Persian Gulf to the wider Near East. How did they sail, though? The usage of flat-bottomed rivercraft and seagoing vessels is suggested by tiny models, terracotta boats, and carved images, even though no complete Harappan ships have survived. The same seasonal monsoon winds that would eventually propel Indian and Arabian commerce across the Indian Ocean were probably employed by them. Using celestial cues and current patterns, Harappan seafarers most likely hugged coasts, pausing at natural harbors and estuaries. The Harappans were exceptionally peaceful in contrast to the warrior-oriented nations of their day. There is minimal indication of fortifications or combat in their cities. This adds considerably more intrigue to their maritime ties. They weren't taking over other countries. Through trade and diplomacy, they were bringing them together. After that, the society started to deteriorate around 1900 BCE. Cities were abandoned, trade decreased, and rivers changed. A solitary query remained as their script vanished with them. How far were their ships able to sail? The water pathways are still there, carved into silent stones, seals and harbours, but their voices are no longer heard. The water wasn't merely a route for the ancient Greeks, it was fate. Greek civilization developed in a world where sailing was just as important as farming, surrounded by the Aegean, Ionian, and Mediterranean seas. The Greeks transformed marine culture into art, science, and strategy from the period of the Homeric epics until the height of Athenian naval supremacy. Their early tales, of Jason pursuing the Golden Fleece and Odysseus fighting sea monsters, were more than just myths. They represented a people that were closely connected to the water. The ocean was essential to the identity and commerce of Greek city-states, such as Athens, Corinth, and Rhodes. Waves were ruled by their gods. Their heroes sailed away. Their empires were supported by ambition and wooden ships. Greek immigrants began establishing cities around the Mediterranean by the 8th century BCE, from Sicily to the Black Sea coast. These colonies weren't outposts of the military. They served as important ports in an extensive commercial network, as well as centers of trade and cultural satellites. Grain, metals, Greek pottery, olive oil, wine, and slaves were traded back and forth. Greek sailors used oral navigation knowledge that had been passed down through the generations, coastal sightlines, and the stars, particularly the rising and setting of particular constellations, to guide them. Simple merchant ships gave way to powerful war machines like the trireme, a sleek, three-tiered galley with a bronze battering ram and space for up to 170 men. The trireme was a floating representation of Athens' democracy and power, not just a ship. Athens had the strongest navy in antiquity when it peaked in the 5th century BCE. The Delian League evolved into an Athenian-led maritime empire after beginning as a defensive coalition against Persia. Athens' golden period of philosophy, architecture, and theatre was sustained by their navy, which guaranteed control over sea passages, tributes from allies, and the unrestricted flow of resources into the city. However, vulnerability accompanied power. Athens' over-reliance on sea superiority backfired during the Peloponnesian War against Sparta. Its demise was caused by internal conflict, blockades, and naval setbacks. Nevertheless, the legacy persisted. The foundation for Roman and later European sailing was established by Greek maritime advances in shipbuilding, cartography, and celestial navigation. Their view of the sea as a platform for tragedy, knowledge, and glory continues to influence Western thought today. The Romans were latecomers to the sea for a nation who had begun as shepherds and farmers on land. But after they did, they destroyed the ancient world's naval forces rather than merely joining them. The Mediterranean, which the Romans proudly referred to as Mare Nostrum, or our sea, was formerly a patchwork of competing fleets and dispersed colonies. Rome was not a naval superpower in the early years. While Carthage, established by Phoenician settlers, governed the western Mediterranean with the most powerful navy in the region, the Etruscans and Greeks dominated the coastlines of Italy. But during the Punic Wars, everything was different. When the Romans realized how strong Carthage's navy was, they took a risk. A captured Carthaginian warship was reverse-engineered by them. They constructed a full fleet, hundreds of ships, in a matter of months, demonstrating an incredible level of industrial resolve. The Corvus, a boarding bridge that converted sea wars into land fighting, was something that was specifically Roman. This invention capitalized on Rome's infantry prowess, enabling legionaries to attack opposing ships like they were storming a stronghold. Rome gained naval superiority as well as authority over Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and eventually the whole Mediterranean coast after defeating Carthage in the Punic Wars. Grain, soldiers, and exotic commodities were transported from Egypt, Gaul, Syria, and other places by Roman galleys, both military and commercial, which guarded sea channels. The Mediterranean was transformed into a Roman highway by the thriving ports of Ostia and Alexandria. This maritime authority played a major role in the Pax Romana, a 2-century period of relative calm. Once the scene of warring empires and pirate ships, the sea has now stabilized as a commercial area. The capital was fueled by grain exports. Silk, pearls, spices and other luxury products arrived from China and India by sea routes that led to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. With the use of comprehensive maritime itineraries known as periploi, Roman sailors employed a combination of dead reckoning, coastal sailing, and celestial navigation. Their mastery of wind and current patterns, particularly the Etesian winds, allowed them to make return trips in the eastern Mediterranean predictable despite their lack of compasses. Rome maintained itself on the water in addition to conquering the land. Its navy maintained communication across great distances, safeguarded trade, and upheld imperial will. The Romans accomplished something that no other culture had yet accomplished with their fleets. They created a regulated kingdom out of the disorderly water. An unseen network of maritime channels, created with wind, memory, and stars rather than ink, united the ancient world long before modern maps, compasses, and diesel engines. From the double-hulled canoes of the Pacific to the reed boats of the Nile, these early maritime cultures defined the waters rather than merely exploring them. Their influence can still be seen in every port, trade route, and ship that travels the oceans today. Future navigation was built on the information that the Minoans, Phoenicians, Austronesians, Egyptians, and others had passed down. Without metal hulls or written charts, these cultures learned to sail in time with the earth, read the sky like a map, and construct ships that could last months at sea. Their findings were cumulative rather than solitary. Every maritime civilization added a new thread to the fabric of world navigation by learning from its forebears or neighbors. The record-keeping required for intricate marine trade was made possible by Phoenician alphabets. Efforts to resurrect navigating without equipment in the 20th century were influenced by Austronesian navigation traditions that had been passed down orally for generations. Ancient geography began with Greek observations of the winds and stars. Roman engineering provided us with ports and lighthouses that are still seen in modern harbour architecture. The ties were even more important than the tools. Ideas were able to spread more quickly than troops thanks to maritime pathways. Religions travelled via sea. So did illnesses, agriculture, language, and technology. The ancient world's marine cultures transported civilizations, not just items. The ancient silk highways would have ended at the coast without them. Without them, distant peoples could have remained strangers for all time, and empires might never have emerged. Despite all of their achievements, many of these early sailors were still unnamed. Seldom were their tales recorded in writing. Their vessels deteriorated and disappeared. Fragments, ceramic shards in a submerged cargo hold, a port structure buried under contemporary concrete, and a star map engraved on bone or bark are all that remain. However, what effect they have, that continues to change with the tide. These early courageous individuals who dared to pursue the horizon are responsible for every container ship that passes through the Suez Canal, every satellite-guided cargo run across the Pacific, and every naval patrol in the Mediterranean. They were never primitive, even though they were ancient. They were the original navigators of the human story. Royal birth was both a blessing and a curse in ancient times. A child was elevated beyond a human being the moment they were born into a palace. They turned into an empire's future, a symbol and a political tool. They didn't start their education in a classroom. It started in the nursery, where rumors of ancestry, legacy, and impending danger were all about. Elite children were raised for leadership from the beginning, in contrast to common children who learned survival via hard work. Every move they made and every word they uttered was observed, adjusted, and planned. Their lives were practice runs for performances, for thrones they had not yet merited. Reading wasn't something they learned for fun. They acquired knowledge in order to understand treaties. They didn't acquire the ability to communicate verbally. They learnt to recite laws, compel obedience, and flatter foreign envoys with well-considered words. Although the subject matter of their schooling was largely influenced by geography and dynasty, the objectives were the same: continuity, charm, and control. While an Egyptian heir would be exposed to priestly hieroglyphs, ceremonies, and sacred mythology, scribes may drill a Babylonian prince in cuneiform. Philosophy was vital in Greece. Etiquette was militaristic in Persia. The curriculum in China was dominated by Confucianism. They even had political toys, symbolic animals, board games that mimicked strategy, and miniature weapons all represented the roles kids were supposed to learn. Tutors were handlers as well as teachers. They were elite, loyal, and frequently expendable, having been carefully selected by the court. The instructor bore the consequences if the royal child failed. There was always a huge stake. An illiterate heir was a liability to the country. A weak or unprepared child may end up as a pawn in the hands of rivals or aspirational family members. Therefore, education was not about developing oneself. It was about surviving the government. Royal education, despite its rigidity, may also be brilliant. Long before the rest of the world, these kids were introduced to astronomy, medicine, foreign languages, ethics, and art. A few of them went on to become polymaths, statesmen, generals, and scholars who were brought up to not just rule, but also to surpass all other minds in the room. In the ancient world, being born a royal was a lifelong challenge rather than merely a lucky birth. And the first battleground was education. Every strong leader in antiquity had a much less well-known person behind them, the mentor. These weren't merely praising nannies. They were political operatives, generals, monks, and thinkers. Their assignment? To mold a child into a king, a diplomat, and occasionally a god, in addition to an adult. Aristotle and Alexander the Great's tutor-student relationship has had a greater historical impact than few others. Aristotle was chosen by Philip of Macedon and entrusted with transforming the brash prince into more than a fighter. He gave him a voracious appetite for information and taught him geography, zoology, philosophy, ethics, and rhetoric. Alexander brought manuscripts of Homer and intellectual writings with him like holy weapons when he later overran the known globe. In addition to imparting knowledge, Aristotle had shaped the inner world of a potential conqueror. Aristotle, however, was not an exception. The Stoic statesman and philosopher Seneca was tasked with tutoring the young Nero in the Roman Empire. He made an effort to instill virtue, reason, and self-control in the youngster. Regretfully, Nero became one of Rome's most notorious despots, according to history. Although Seneca wasn't solely to blame, the failure demonstrated how even the most skilled educators couldn't always defeat a student's darker tendencies or courtly influence. Because of their allegiance and capacity for discipline, military men were frequently selected as royal tutors in Persia. Under the careful supervision of aristocratic mentors, princes of the Achaemenid dynasty received moral instruction in justice and truthfulness, as well as instruction in hunting, horseback riding, and battle from the age of 7. They received a pragmatic, austere, and intensely politicized education. Princes' upbringing in ancient China was greatly influenced by Confucian intellectuals. They ingrained the values of ceremony, hierarchy, and filial devotion. However, the instructor who taught the stuff is doomed. If a lecture went against the emperor's beliefs, a slip of the tongue may result in execution or exile. Living in the background and influencing history with the words and hands of others was what it meant to be a royal tutor. They needed to be commanding but submissive, smart but unseen. They were envious, crossed a line, and got too close. If they failed, they were thrown out. succeed, and only if their pupils created history did their names endure. The elite children of the ancient world learnt from systems constructed behind palace walls, private academies, temple libraries, and in certain circumstances, hidden priesthood schools that guarded information like it was gold, whilst the sons and daughters of farmers learned from life. For royals, education was about controlling the flow of knowledge, the one thing more dangerous than armies, rather than just preparing them for power. Priesthoods served as the guardians of education in ancient Egypt. In temple schools, royal children, particularly those who would become pharaohs, were taught to read hieroglyphics, memorize religious texts, comprehend ceremonial practice, and study astronomy and medicine. The public was given access to these skills. Only those destined to rule or interpret the divine were given access to literacy, which was uncommon and revered. A large portion of this training took place at what are sometimes referred to as secret schools. Knowledge was passed from priest to student in total secrecy in temples such as those at Heliopolis or Karnak. The curriculum was political as well as religious. In the view of their subjects, kings who were skilled in omen interpretation, spell recitation, or ritual planning had power over life and death. There was an elite educational system in Persia. According to Herodotus, the sons of Persian nobles, particularly those who were close to the monarch, received their education in what he called the king's school. These guys gained leadership, archery, riding, and truth-telling skills while remaining out of the public eye. They also adopted Zoroastrian statecraft and ethics. Princes weren't the only ones who would benefit from this education. Future satraps, generals, and administrators, men who would be expected to loyally lead armies and provinces, were also expected to attend. Royal children may go to gurukulas in India, which are remote forest schools administered by knowledgeable Brahmins. Princes were frequently placed under the tutelage of a single guru who taught them everything from Vedic hymns to martial arts, whereas commoners had little access to such instruction. The schooling was intellectual, physical, spiritual, holistic, and once more highly hierarchical. Knowledge was adapted to role, caste, and fate. Elite children, such as those in Sparta or Athens, received specialized schooling even in Greece, although several cities had more democratic educational systems. The state-run military academy, the Agog, was where Spartan royal sons were sent. Since winning a war was only half the fight, the Athenians employed private instructors in rhetoric, strategy, and logic. Perhaps even more crucial is understanding how to win an argument. All of these realms did not only teach knowledge, it was reserved for those who could wield it, guarded, and passed like a sword. Even though royal women were not frequently expected to command armies or run governments in antiquity, their education was nonetheless important. Indeed, rich daughters' education was as planned and calculating as their brothers throughout many dynasties. In addition to being daughters, royal women were also potential queens, priestesses, political puppets, and occasionally influential figures. Royal ladies might have a great deal of power in Egypt. Hatshepsut and Nefertiti were not just queens who stood behind pharaohs. They conducted diplomacy, constructed temples, and reigned. Education was necessary for this. In ancient Egypt, temple priests frequently instructed princesses in hieroglyphic reading, reciting religious texts, administering estates, and carrying out holy rites. Those who would marry Amun's gods were initiated into priestly orders, where they learned theology and rituals that were well above the level of the average person. Some even had expertise comparable to that of their male counterparts and participated in governance. Despite being confined behind palace curtains, royal women of Persia were not idle. Keeping courtly alliances, managing enormous estates, and supervising coffers were all tasks assigned to the Achaemenid queens. They received instruction in political etiquette, diplomacy, and bookkeeping in order to accomplish this. Persian queens were known to govern behind the scenes, according to Greek writers like Xenophon, suggesting a subdued yet powerful education. There are conflicting accounts from ancient Greece. Even rich women in Athens received no formal education and were expected to stay at home, managing the home, weaving, music, and occasional reading. However, royal ladies of Sparta were brought up to be strong. They received instruction in Spartan values, eloquence, and physical fitness. While her husband was at battle, a Spartan princess was free to express her opinions and rule over properties. Additionally, women frequently carried on the tradition when Spartan males lost their lives in combat at a young age. Religious and dynastic priorities were mirrored in the education of noble women in China and India. In order to increase their attractiveness and prestige, royal girls in the Gupta Empire were occasionally taught Sanskrit, music, poetry, and philosophy. Empresses and consorts in imperial China were instructed in calligraphy, palace etiquette, and Confucian ideals. Under the pretense of etiquette, those intended for political positions such as Wu Zetian or Empress Lu Ji went far beyond, becoming experts in statecraft, governance, and surveillance. The road taken by royal women was sensitive. Instead of ruling, they were supposed to charm, but they frequently took over when things changed. Their education wasn't a luxury when they did, they had it in their arsenal. Speech won empires if swords won battles. Speaking was not considered a soft skill in the ancient world, it was a weapon. Public persuasion, rhetoric, and language were crucial instruments for survival, diplomacy, and rule. Elite kids were therefore taught more than just how to talk. They were taught to use words to enthrall, control, and command. In ancient Greece, where eloquence was regarded as the mark of a civilized leader, this was never more evident. Persuasive speech was taught as both an art and a science by the sophists and Isocrates, among other masters, to the Athenians. Young elites honed their skills in public debate, speech delivery, and the three main components of classical persuasion: ethos, pathos, and logos. A sharp tongue could be more helpful than a sharp blade for individuals who were brought up to rule. This ideal transcended cultural boundaries. Oratory was taught to aristocratic boys in ancient Rome from an early age. They rehearsed presenting arguments with composure and etiquette, studied courtroom tactics, and committed Cicero's speeches to memory. This was more than courtly display for imperial successors. It was a matter of survival. A badly chosen phrase could lead to controversy. The Senate could be influenced by an outstanding speech. Words were important even in kings with absolute power. The king was revered in Egypt as a divine orator. His declarations had legal and ceremonial significance. Royal children were taught ceremonial formulas and formal language, which they recited during state ceremonies and religious processions. Elite youth in Mesopotamia were taught persuasive writing techniques in scribal schools, which helped them create mythological hymns, diplomatic letters, and royal decrees. Language was different but just as important in India and Persia. Persian princes received training in a variety of languages, including Greek or Medine, Aramaic for diplomacy, and Old Persian for court. They learnt how to use timing and tone to frighten, negotiate, and compliment. Sanskrit epics and philosophical works such as the Arthashastra, which provided practical instruction in eloquence, espionage, and diplomacy, were studied by Indian royal pupils, particularly during the empires. Speech-making and storytelling were forms of authority even in societies where oral tradition predominated, such as among the elites of the Celtic and Germanic cultures. A prince with poor communication skills could hardly be a leader, because power was ultimately spoken into being rather than simply taken. The sky was more than just a collection of stars to the ancient royals. It served as a clock, calendar, compass, and occasionally a script from God, and the numbers counted under that sky. For royal heirs, astronomy and mathematics were required courses, a ruler's understanding of time, taxation, Architecture, battle, and even fate itself was influenced by these fundamental disciplines. Babylonian elites were researching base 60 math systems, forecasting eclipses, and calculating astronomical movements with astounding accuracy in Mesopotamia long before Pythagoras was well known. Princes were frequently taught to read cuneiform tablets containing information on stars, weather, and omens by royal scribes and priest astronomers. These were not abstract computations. When it came to planting crops, waging war, and carrying out royal rites, they had actual repercussions. Additionally, mathematics was incorporated into almost every aspect of authority in Egyptian royal education. Following the Nile floods, pharaohs had to comprehend land measuring in order to levy taxes. They also had to supervise large construction projects, like as pyramids, tombs, and temples, which called for logistical expertise and an understanding of geometry. Egypt's liturgical calendar was based on astronomy, and royal children were trained to follow Sirius's heliacal rise, which signaled the beginning of the year and the yearly flood. Royal class people in ancient India were introduced to the rich mathematical traditions of the Sulba Sutras and later the algebraic and planetary motion works of Aryabhata. In order to synchronize ceremonies and decipher omens, astronomy was both scientific and spiritual. An educated person could decipher the stars on their own, but a wise ruler sought their advice. These teachings were improved by the Greeks, who made them more methodical and intellectual. Alexander, a Macedonian prince, would study logic and ethics in addition to astronomy and mathematics. Plato and Aristotle, among others, had an influence on Greek royal education, which viewed mathematics as a means of comprehending the universe's order, and consequently, one's role as a ruler within it. Astronomy even played a significant role in the imperial courts of China. Emperors were viewed as cosmic go-betweens, and their divine right to govern was confirmed by their capacity to forecast heavenly occurrences. Princes received education in lunar cycles, eclipse prediction, and calendar change, and court astronomers held significant influence. Every culture had an educated ruler who controlled not only the populace but also space, time, and fate. And their quiet advisors were the stars and math. A monarch could be crowned by books, but swords maintained them in power. Education for ancient aristocracy extended beyond the classroom. It also applied to the battlefield, when valor, physical prowess, and strategic acumen were just as important as doctrine or diplomacy. One unsaid reality was instilled in the minds of elite children, particularly male heirs. Your kingdom will be taken by someone else if you are unable to protect it. This notion was the law of Sparta. By the age of 7, royal sons were enrolled in the state's cruel military institution, the Agog. They received training in hand-to-hand combat, endurance, pain tolerance, and warfare tactics, while being deprived of their comfort. Princes were not exempt either. Alongside other Spartan lads, they battled, suffered, and made it through, developing a camaraderie through adversity that would help them on the battlefield. Royal boys in Persia received education in the 3 R's: archery, truth-telling, riding, and nobility. Both for royal hunting expeditions, which served as strategic exercises, and for combat, horsemanship was crucial. Archery was not just a talent. It stood for self-control, concentration, and fighting skill. A Persian prince considered unsuitable to hold power if he was incapable of using a bow. The Kshatriyas and other warrior classes in India received martial science training from an early age. Children of royalty were trained to use bows, maces, spears, and swords. Epics like the Mahabharata, which taught not only how to battle but also why to fight, and what honor is required in the face of death, were another source they used to study the philosophies of combat. Princes from Egypt and Mesopotamia were also anticipated to serve as commanders. Under the supervision of military leaders, they rehearsed spear-throwing, wrestling, and chariot driving. Although pharaohs were frequently portrayed as smiting their opponents, This dramatic portrayal was based on actual training. War wasn't hypothetical. Leaders took the lead. Manly courage, discipline, and virtues were imparted to the young patrician elite in Rome. They studied military histories, learned formations, and practiced with wooden swords. Julius Caesar was more than just an academic. He was a seasoned commander who had been taught to balance sword and pen since he was a young man. Even Chinese princes, who were frequently more shielded by the bureaucracy, included archery, horseback riding, and martial arts in their princely curriculum. Both the civil and military ideals, the Wen and the Wu, were supposed to be embodied by the emperor. Education was mandatory in every empire. It was a matter of survival. A misplaced phrase might spark a conflict for a royal child. An extended look could lead to a scandal. Being able to sit, talk, and smile was just as useful in ancient courts as being able to brandish a sword. Etiquette was not a frivolity, it was a plan. Royal upbringing instilled in the successors of empires the notion that every bow and feast was a game of survival. Court etiquette was almost completely standardized from China to Persia. Princes in Han China were supposed to learn and follow the li, which were ceremonial laws that specified everything from how to properly meet a superior to how to grieve. One infraction of the rules can be seen as rebellion. Young royals were instructed in precise movement, restrained speech, and how to read the balance of power in each space. The art of courtly appearance was taught to royal children in Persia. This covered more than simply attire and etiquette. It also covered how to deal with envoys, avoid insults, and react coolly under duress. They received indirect communication training, learning the political jargon needed to get by in a palace full of spies and sycophants. The science of politics and ethics, or Natishastra, was an important component of elite education in India. A ruler must deal with treachery, employ informants, and strike a balance between power and diplomacy, according to texts like the Arthashastra. Because a single misaligned alliance or careless act may cost them their kingdom or their lives, royal successors were expected to grasp these ideas at a young age. Court behavior was taken seriously by the Greeks and Romans as well. Roman lads were taught the skill of flattery, public behavior, and surveillance, whereas Athenian aristocrats were taught charis, or personal charm and grace. In addition to learning how to fight, Julius Caesar also learned how to influence senators, discredit opponents, and determine a man's level of ambition by his tone. Etiquette and divinity became muddled in Egypt. The pharaoh was a god, not merely a member of the royal family. Since royal children's bodies were regarded as representations of cosmic order, they were instructed to always act with calm dignity. Their posture was important as well. Their silence was power in silence, not passivity. And always, espionage was hidden beneath the etiquette and customs. Princes frequently learned from tutors how to uncover secrets, assess loyalty, and recognize dishonesty. Because survival depended on watching back, and there was always someone watching in every palace. A royal education was always intended to mold a dynasty's future, not just a child. Every instruction in reasoning, combat, manners, and language held the weight of generations for the elites of antiquity. An educated monarch might bring kingdoms together, maintain empires, and gain immortality in myth and marble. An unprepared one might cause everything to fall apart. Royal education was essentially the empire's bet on itself. Each coin produced, each copy of a scroll, and each teacher employed was an investment in one person's capacity to maintain the realm. And that child, whether a pawn, princess, or prince, was under tremendous pressure. Consider Alexander the Great. He used more than simply desire and cavalry tactics to conquer half of the world. It had its origins in years of specialized training under Aristotle, who stoked his curiosity in knowledge, argument, and divine destiny. Alexander became a symbol of Hellenistic unification by bringing Greek culture, science, and diplomacy with him, in addition to his conquests. Nero, on the other hand, received intense training from Seneca, the Stoic philosopher. Despite having access to all of Rome's educational resources, he nevertheless resorted to excess, cruelty, and paranoia. In addition to being personal, his failure damaged Rome's reputation as an imperial power, sparking uprisings and undermining its authority for years. As it happened, education was not a guarantee. The object was a crucible. The stakes were just as high for royal ladies. A princess might be married off as a peace sacrifice, a queen consort might become regent, or she might become a sovereign in her own right. Cleopatra's and Wusitian's education was not a luxury. Rather, it was a prelude to dominion. They remained alive and in power because of their multilingualism, treasury management skills, and ability to handle lethal court politics. The influence of these royal educations persisted long after they passed away. By establishing schools, libraries, and knowledge temples, numerous kings turned to become patrons of education. Their own early education was repeated, honed, and ritualized to serve as the model for subsequent generations. The royal child's education was ultimately about legacy, preserving the past, and ensuring that the future could be governed with wisdom rather than force. It was never just about the child. Since the throne was inherited in the ancient world, it was necessary to teach people how to maintain it,